Hello and welcome to the Centre for Cyber Economics podcast with me, your host, Rebecca McLaughlin-Eastham. In this episode, we'll explore how cybersecurity underpins economic resilience in both developed and rapidly growing emerging economies. My special guest is John Defterios, former emerging markets editor and anchor at CNN, board member for Sustainable Energy for All, and senior advisor at APCO Worldwide. John, it's great to see you. Thank you for talking to me today.
Nice to be back.
Let me start by asking you, from your experience covering emerging markets, how do you see cybersecurity shaping economic resilience and investor confidence?
I think the latter phrase, investor confidence, is really important here, Rebecca, because I see it as a priority list of good governance. So alongside, a business index rating a country or transparency, tax policy, cyber policy and cyber resilience are now part of that investor checklist, if you will. So you do need a robust cybersecurity architecture. And as you just look at the numbers, now if you go back to 2021, weekly attacks on organizations was over 800. And now we're at nearly 2,000 a week in 2025. So think about the growth, which is about 58%. And now in the last 6 months, it's become commonplace in the news organizations around the world. It was something that was not covered before. It's now been uncovered, and you have names like the scattered spider, or you see airports being attacked, right? You see supermarkets, healthcare systems, critical infrastructure. So it's now commonplace, and I think it's actually part of our common vernacular, if you will.
The GCF and the World Economic Forum, as we know, have come together to launch the Centre for Cyber Economics. Why do you see this being so important for the sector?
Well, number one, data for the last 10 years is kind of defined as the new gold, and we know what gold prices have been doing, right? So having accurate data is really important. And even as we co-chair the GCF every year, when you go to research your panels and you hunt down figures, and the GCF has their own data that they share, and it's great because it's consolidated, but you find different numbers from different parts of the world. So that means it's not reliable. And I thought Jürgen Stark, the former Secretary General of Interpol, the panel I was chairing, said something that was quite alarming. He said even in his country of Germany, where he's from, he said they only report 10% of the cyber crimes, partially because companies don't want to reveal the fact they've been hacked, or if there was ransomware involved. That's understandable. But if a country is reporting 10% of the incidents, and then you have a country, say, for example, in Asia, that is reporting 40%, how do we really get the accurate number of what's out there? So the GCF for the 2025 meeting in Riyadh had pegged the number of the overall impact of cybercrime at better than $10 trillion, with estimates going to $14 trillion by 2030. But then you see some estimates for cybercrime growing to $23 trillion in 3 years. So what am I saying here? It says we need a common platform that shares up-to-date data. And it would be great if it was actually renewed throughout the year. So if there is an attack, what was the expectation of that attack? What did it cost? But then we have to think in a wider context. What are the ripple effects? So there was a cyber crime, for example, but then there was lost GDP. And then as we have a baseline, we can track it over time, which will encourage more cooperation between governments. And I think actually more cooperation between governments and the private sector, because everybody's coming out of the shadows to say this is one of the top 5 threats of the world.
Absolutely. And partnership, knowledge sharing, collaboration, something I'll come on to in a minute. But I just want to ask you about energy in cyberspace before that, because as we know, they're deeply linked in global markets. Tell me, John, how critical is cybersecurity to safeguarding the energy sector and critical infrastructure, particularly as economies transition to greener and more interconnected systems?
Well, it's a fairly complex question, but so let's cover the sector first. Energy is the 4th most attacked industry. So 1 in 10 attacks are in the energy sector. And there's a huge issue here, and it goes back to your first question in this dialogue that we have together. You really have to have the confidence of investors before they like to come in. So what do I mean by that? Say I'm an international energy company, and I'm involved in oil and gas, or I'm involved in the renewable sector. I have to trust your systems before I can deploy money. We had Ahmed Al-Kuwaiter, who's the head of innovation and technology for Aramco. And he says, we're facing this because we want to invest in energy access for Africa or Southeast Asia and Latin America. And he said something very prescient. Before we go in and have a partner, we have to go in as the technology and innovation division and scope the landscape, because we have to know whether their IT systems are robust enough for us to trust the systems. And this is supported by the data that's out in the market that 90% of the international energy companies suffer breaches from third parties. So they're the weakest link. So again, if you go back to the idea of, am I going to invest in your country? Is there transparency? How's the banking system? How's the ease of doing business? How's your cybersecurity? That's how we see it today. And I think that's very accurate. And you know what? Energy fits into that bucket, Rebecca, of critical infrastructure, right? And if you look at the grid systems around the world, and this was the case at an energy event I was chairing last year, they were saying we need at least $1 trillion to upgrade the grids to be able to hold renewable energy around the world, right? They haven't been modernized. But at the same time, you have to make them fortified against cyber attacks. So, critical infrastructure is target number one because they're easy targets, if you will, because they're spread out all over the world. And energy, the good thing about this is that I think the energy sector, if you take Aramco as one example, they know of the risks. They've been dealing with those risks for 20 years. They built and fortified their systems, but they do need to make sure that the developing world is up to speed with what they want to get accomplished if they invest in a country. It's just one example.
Globally, we're seeing record amounts of capital being deployed into AI. Does this make it much more complex for those involved in cyber today?
Well, I find it pretty extraordinary because I was tracking this number ahead of our podcast together, and there was $3 trillion invested in the AI sector. And then if you think about, there's even more money going into the data centers, the power centers to support them, right? So there's money being deployed right now. A research study found that large language models have automated phishing, and it can lower the cost for those who want to do that cybercrime by 95%, right? There's even the dark LLMs, which gives access to those perpetrators to very dangerous information. So we saw $1 trillion go out by scammers just in phishing last year, and that's before the rapid deployment of artificial intelligence. And most in the industry say, and I'm talking about 80 to 90%, say it's the number one challenge over the next 5 years. Are their cyber systems able to resist these large language models landing in the hands of the very dark players in the world?
To what extent, John, do you believe that emerging markets can leapfrog in building cybersecure economies, or are they still simply too exposed compared to advanced economies?
I live in London, so in the London Underground, they always tell you mind the gap between the train and the platform. I think we should, and I think the Global Cybersecurity Forum has done this, is minding the gap between the developed and the developing world. So the reference point is that you have in the developing economies money being allocated $1 per capita. In the developed world, it's $30 per capita. And if you kind of singled out the United States or a country in the European Union, it's probably even higher, right? So, and I talked to one African leader, it was Macky Sall, the former leader of Senegal. He says, look, it's not a dollar per capita in Senegal, I can tell you that for sure. And in Senegal, they have major partnerships to develop their oil and gas offshore. And they feel very vulnerable. And they talked about the attacks against the Ministry of Finance and against Petro-Senegal, for example. We often think of the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, lending money for infrastructure, for roads and for bridges, for water systems. It all makes sense, for power systems. But I think in that bucket, because of the rise of cybercrime, we should think about when you're getting lending, that cybersecurity is part of that portfolio because it's very important for development and investment is going up. But if you're an emerging market economy or a developing world economy, you got hit by COVID-19 and your budgets are very strained, is cybersecurity at the top of the investment list? Probably not, but it should be. And I think the international lending institutions should, put it on the landscape as something that's critical to protect investments coming into to the country.
It's so true. So often the urgent crowds out the important.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it.
How does cybersecurity fit into the narrative of economic diversification and global positioning? And should this be shifting?
I think this fits into the narrative. Do you trust your currency, for example, right? Do you have a trust in the US dollar or the euro, the British pound, the Japanese yen? And that trust is built on, decades, if not centuries, of trading that currency, right? I think the same now for e-commerce, right? You do so many transactions on your phone or your laptop. You have to have trust in those transactions. And, the private sector is moving very quickly to make sure that they're fortified. And again, if you think about how Africa leapfrogged over the last 20 years, it was through the mobile phone, right? But you have to make sure that the cyber defenses for those mobile transactions are very robust, especially going back to what we talked about before, artificial intelligence. And then, we're 4 or 5 years away from widespread deployment of quantum computing. So it's going to make it much more complex for the developing world, I think, to make sure that they have the firewalls to protect economic development.
After the COVID-19 shock, which of course hit supply chains, there's been a move that we've seen away from globalization and the institutions that support global governance and economic cooperation. So I'm keen to get your view on why there should be more and not less collaboration when it comes to cyber threats.
I think this goes to the theme of the Global Cybersecurity Forum, right? And they really do support collaboration and kind of sharing information across governments. What are the best case studies that you can use today? I was really impressed, when we had Chris Inglis, for example, who worked in the United States, and he was saying after we had so many attacks, it became a White House initiative. And we couldn't just talk about public-private sector collaboration. We had to have the key agencies linked directly to the private sector and instant reporting. And that's the same thing that's been developed in Saudi Arabia. Again, with the fireside chat we had with Saudi Aramco, they said, we have all the critical infrastructure companies on one platform with the National Cybersecurity Authority, and they respond in real time. Data's key, so you have to have that sort of trust. It's great that 125 countries have signed on to international collaboration in this area, but you also have to be careful. That's great. We have 125 countries involved, but they all have their own policies. And it was a kind of a landmark movement in July of this year when the Open-Ended Working Group for the United Nations, in its final report, marked a major milestone in global efforts to build common ground on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. It's a very tricky game. There's state-supported actors, so it gets very complex. When it comes to cybersecurity, some countries don't like sharing their data, but more collaboration on the best practices. And even if you go country by country, kind of my strategy or thoughts on this are that in a country, if you have it right, and then say you're a member of ASEAN and you say, look, we've done this well, let's share this strategy within ASEAN. Or if we're in the Gulf, you say, the Gulf Cooperation Council says, this is a case study, we do this. We're in a partnership together. We have a free trade agreement, for example. We collaborate with our central banks. They should move on deeper collaboration when it comes to cybersecurity.
Sticking with collaboration, albeit in a slightly different manner, and country defenses from cyber threats, obviously this requires a skilled workforce. Tell me, John, do you see a rising sense of urgency in that regard, and in particular for the role of women in the cyber workforce?
Well, there's investment of $200 billion annually into the sector, but businesses are struggling to keep pace with the escalating cyber threats that we talked about. And right now, as we speak, 72% of the jobs are filled. That leaves a gap of 28%, right? So number one, only 14% of organizations are confident that they have the people and skills they need today. And they said that the skills gap has widened by 8% in the last year because the market is changing, right? We have more technology being put forward. Joy Schick of Microsoft said that, and she said it in a very positive way, but she said, and this is a quote from her, male leaders need to hear women's lived-in experience because listening and learning those experiences creates the empathy that will create an environment to support women in this space. If you have a dire need of nearly 3 million workers in the world today, and you see the programs being rolled out in North America and Europe, South Asia especially is really strong in the education of cybersecurity, but what are we doing to encourage women to go into the workforce? If it's the flexibility, if they have a family, to be able to deliver, right? They can deliver in very profound ways. But we should be encouraging, the STEM studies anyway. I think the Global Cybersecurity Forum and the Women in Cyber roundtables, what we do in the public sessions and the private sessions, really starts to build that narrative because they have participants from around the world and the universities, from the far west in the United States and from the far east and the global south. They're participating and they're saying, these are our case studies. These are our examples. This is where it's worked. Some of the employers don't want to give that flexibility. We should be candid about it and see if we can tackle it. But it's needed more so than ever. And even on a personal note, I said to my youngest daughter who's graduating from university, have you thought about cybersecurity? And she had a conversation with one of the female professors that attended the GCF this year. Again, getting that encouragement to explore it, to see if it's an option. But, you have to kind of unveil it to the world that it's vital, but it's also extremely interesting, both from a technical standpoint, but from a policy standpoint as well, because it fits into the wider footprint of what we talked about. If you want to be a successful economy and a stable government, you need stable cybersecurity.
Of course you do. And more representation, more ladies like Joy would be very much welcome too. Maybe your daughter, another Defterios in the studio soon. John, we have to leave our conversation there, but it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with John Defterios of APCO Worldwide. For more episodes in this series, just head to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Until next time, take care and goodbye.